Hello, I am Rebecca Tarullo, and I interviewed the elder at my school. You see, I work at MSW Institute Charter High School, which is an African-based charter school located in Philadelphia. And so we have the hierarchy of elders at our school. So I chose to interview the elder, and I talked about African American elder identity through the research I've done and through my interview with the elder. And this will be what I am working on. So to start off, we have Erickson's theory. He had his whole theory of psychodevelopment, and it talks about how identity, it starts in adolescence. So at about age 13. So it starts in adolescence, right after the last stage, but it continues to be addressed later on through life. So it's not cemented by age 13. By age 13, this is when they start exploring identity. So identity versus identity confusion. So during this phase, kids might try on different roles to see if they fit. And we see this through puberty, kids trying out different fashion trends, trying out different career options, classes, friend groups, family roles. We see them kind of try to fit in to see which works really well for them. Last is just, I thought it'd be interesting to mention that crises are efforts to adjust to the demands of the social environment. And I believe that it's very important to mention the social environment in this presentation because the man that I interviewed has had a history with the civil rights movement, was alive during that time, and he was pressured, not pressured, that's not the right word. He was influenced by what was going on at the time. And he is even quoted as saying, I've met Malcolm X, I've met Dr. King, and it really pushed me into action. So identity integration was another part that I decided to focus on for this presentation. So that it talks about how identity integration, so it continues across the lifespan. So while it starts in adolescence with Erickson's theory, there are other forms of identity integration there are other forms of identity theories that talk about how we could form it into a new theory, into this larger, more encompassing theory that includes many different parts of identity. So this talks about how identity is across adulthood. So one of the things they mention is that life transitions happen more frequently in adulthood, such as marriage, childbirth, divorce, job changes. It impacts the identity because, when someone has a kid, their identity changes to being a parent. When someone gets married, their identity changes to being a husband or a wife or a partner, and it impacts the identity. So these transitions become part of our identity as we grow older. So it is vital to healthy psychosocial functions and can be detrimental if not present. And secondly, because it ties together events on adulthood. So identity integration is very important due to those reasons. So this challenges the identity theories that Erickson had said that it kind of happens in adolescence. It really does just develop over the years. So it really starts in adolescence, but never stops fully developing. So our identity is not a static thing. It's not just a concrete one time come to it. It is always evolving. So identity transitions. I interviewed, his name is Bob Alonzo Matthews is his name. He is the elder at Imhotep Institute Charter High School. So just some background on him. Lonnie served in the armed forces. He served in the army. He grew up in the civil rights movement, and he talks a lot about his biggest part of his identity is his teaching career. And I will go back to discussing how he holds the importance of teaching and his role as a teacher and how he combines it with his involvement in the civil rights era. He doesn't really mention much of his army, but he did his time in the army. But he does mention a lot about how he changed as based the opportunities he was given. So meet Alonzo. So Alonzo Matthews is a special education case manager at MSW Institute Charter High School, where he has been at for 25 years. He has been there since the start of the school. He is the oldest teacher at the school. He is referred to as the elder. Every morning we always say, may we have permission from the elders to begin. And this talks about how he is the one who gives us permission, him and another teacher. He gives us permission to begin our day. We start her day. He is in his 70s and he's grown up in the civil rights movement. In our interview, he talked about how he has met some prominent people in the movement. I mentioned earlier how he has met Dr. King and Malcolm X, and he discusses in great detail how teaching has impacted his identity. So one of the most interesting articles that I found throughout this research process is the towards an integration of narrative, identity, generativity, and storytelling in African American elders, and that is written by Dr. Fabius. So this article discusses storytelling and its importance in the African American community and its importance to the elders. So storytelling is very linked to identity in African American elders, and it better explains their experiences. So I wanted to relate this back to what we talk about at my school. So we follow something called Morell's African Centered Pedagogy, so ACP. So one of the results for that is called meaning making. So meaning making is a result in our pedagogy where students create ideologies for themselves as well as seeing representations for themselves in the world. So I believe that that is very important to this because it is showing that there are other ways to find importance in our stories and they find importance in their identity. So the storytelling, which when Babalani gets up in the morning and he does libations, which is what we call our morning circle. So we get into the circle. So maybe we have permission to begin with a pour libation for the libation means we pour respects. We remember our ancestors. We remember the Great Ma'afa, which was what we know as the transatlantic slave trade. However, we don't use the term slaves at my school. We talked about how all of these really impact us. And so he gives us permission in the morning to begin. And when he does the morning circle, he tells a story every time. It may not be the same story every day, but he does like to talk a lot. Babalani will talk a lot. That's why I was really happy to interview him. He always has so much to say. He's an enigma at our school, and he's always the most welcoming person around. So I just think that it's really interesting to mention storytelling because he talks about how his identity is so greatly unraveled in teaching. And he said, he finds joy in giving these students purpose. He helps them. He's working with the seniors. He'll work with the ninth grade next year. And he's told me that he's very excited. And I could quote that he's very excited to work with the ninth graders because he's been with these kids for 4 years and he can see them. This might be his last class that he'll work with before he retires, as he is in his 70s and has been teaching for over 50 years. And he is enjoying it very well. But this study that I found discusses the link. So there's a qualitative investigation that discusses how to increase the knowledge about the experience of African American elders, and how things like poverty and segregation are experienced through narratives. So discrimination was a huge component of the study, and I believe that we discussed this in our interviews together, and how he has been impacted by the civil rights movement. And he mentioned some stuff about the army and being there, but he mentioned he didn't mention too much of the negatives. He's very focused on the positive, and I think that's really important to remember that this is a man who has lived through the civil rights era. He has seen some of the horrible atrocities that have been committed towards Black people of America, just the Black people in the world in general, and he has this positive outlook that he uses to tell stories every day, and I think that's something that's very important. So Bronfenbrenner's theory talks about how we are influenced by our environment. So I thought this was very important because in Bronfenbrenner's theory, culture exists in the macro system. So this article that I found really challenges that. It really challenges this theory of that culture is only in the macro system. So it talks about how it's challenged on its cultural aspect. So it means that culture is a separate system operating from a macro level, but isn't within everyday action. So it talks about it's a separate system from a macro level. It's more important, but it's every day. We see this every day. And I think that it's very important to mention that I do teach at a cultural infusion school. So culture is the biggest part of this school. So we teach these children how their ancestors have grown up and what their stories are. It goes back to storytelling. We tell stories, and it really just brings the two together. So Vygotsky's social cultural theory is also mentioned in this article. There are a few other theories that are mentioned as well, but the biggest one is Vygotsky's. It's a social cultural theory where culture is defined by human experiences and changes human activity and how it's internalized in the psyche. So culture is based off of human experience. Every activity reflects on the cultural background. The elder really reflects back onto this theory. Um, because he really works at an African Infusion School. He leads Libation. He's our senior special education case manager. He really shows that what he's doing reflects back onto his social cultural background, and he does it socially as well. He's part of other groups that talks a lot about how his community is influenced by who he is and where he's come from. So the last article I wanted to talk about is it talks about how it takes a village. And I think that this one is very important. And I have the least written about this one, but I think it's most important that we talk about it because it's not something that I could just summarize in words and put on a screen. So we all have heard the adage, it takes a village to raise a child. And, in we talk about the familial aspects of African American communities, which Babalani mentioned in great detail. He talked greatly. I can quote him saying, I was really raised around the kids, of the parents and the other people in the communities. If my mom wasn't there, I can always guarantee that someone else was there. That he would talk about his neighbors next door. He talked about how he grew up in an environment where he was so intertwined in his community. And I think that relates back to what we were doing with the macro systems and the microsystems and Bronfenbrenner's theory, how the environment really contributes to who we become as a person and our identity. So this article talks a little more about disparities in education. And I know this is a social work program. However, I interviewed a teacher, and I am a teacher. And I interviewed a teacher who has been teaching for 50 years, who is looking at the IDEA Act, and he's looked at No Child Left Behind. And he has acknowledged the many factors there are that contribute to raising children. And he has even said that what the support system that he grew up with, not all these kids grow up with today. And I think he really embodies this article because he talks about how, school systems have failed him. And growing up, they weren't always the best. And he grew up in a time where I just taught an article about Ruby Bridges and how she's still alive today, I believe. And how I was in the 60s, she couldn't go to the school that was close to her. So, the fact that integration is still less than 100 years old is shocking. So I think that he is someone who grew up in a family system that influenced him enough to go into education. So he has been a teacher longer than I've been alive. He received a special education certificate to better help the students that have higher needs than the school system may forget about. And the students love him. Like, Babalani is the culture of the school. I cannot stress that enough. This man is in the hallway saying, "Hello, Queen. Hello, hello." He calls me Queen almost every day. It makes me feel amazing. It raises my spirits. He is a representation of this village. So he is the human embodiment of this village that the article mentions. And it's someone that can talk to the parts of the village that could be changed. When he says that parents may not be as involved in their children's life, especially as a senior, they might assume that their kids are already grown. And he has seen this, but he also experienced this, that he was a kid who grew up and went into the army. He grew up with, he talks a lot about that back neighbor that helped him out. So, and then lastly, these are my resources. And I think that is the end of my presentation.